Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this Scientia Education Academy lecture. I am so pleased that you are able to join us. Before I begin and hand over to Nalini and to our invited speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners and indeed the first educators who are on the land from which we are joining you. And I know that you will also acknowledge the traditional owners and first educators on the lands from which you are also joining us. So as I said, I'd like to welcome you to this Scientia Education Academy lecture. The Scientia Education Academy lecture series are designed to highlight the strategies and thought leaderships of our outstanding educators, and the Scientia Education Fellows who form the Academy aim to provide leadership and vision through their own teaching and mentoring of our colleagues and inspire our students, both in their studies and future careers. So these lectures are part of a broader series of educational events that are offered by the Education Student Experience portfolio. But this is the only event series that is open to the public. And I wanted to let you know that we are recording this lecture so that we can indeed store them, and you can access it after the event. And you can also access the other previous lectures that we have had. So we are very pleased today that part of this series in thinking about thought leadership is that we at times invite external educators to come and speak with us. And our guest today has been invited by one of our co-directors, that's Nalini Pather. So Nalini and Patsy Polly are the co-directors of the Academy, for which we're very grateful. And Nalini is not only the co-director of the Scientia Education Academy, she's a professor in the School of Biomedical Sciences at UNSW. She is the Associate Dean Education within the Faculty of Medicine. And I'm going to hand over to her now to introduce our invited speaker. Thanks so much, Nalini.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Louise. And I'm delighted to actually introduce you to Amish Coates today. Amish is the Director of Higher Education Research Division and the Deputy Director of the Global Research Center for the Assessment of Student Development at Tsinghua University in China. Although I do believe Amish is not in China today. He's in Melbourne working on a project. So welcome, Amish, and we're really delighted that you could join us. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Amish, and then we'll ask him one or two questions to just get to know who the person is behind all the words that we have. So Amish was the Professor of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne and the Program Director at the L.H. Martin Institute for Tertiary Leadership and Management. He was also the Founding Director of the Higher Education Research at the Australian Council for Education Research. And he has quite a illustrious CV, which I'm not going to read out anymore. His main focus is on improving the quality and productivity of higher education, and particularly around assessment. So Amish, thank you again for joining us. And before I hand over to you, I just wanted to ask you a few questions like, what did you do over the weekend and what do you do for fun?
Nalini, thanks. I make it a principle of asking people this question when I introduce them in front of large volumes of people, and it's always confronting. So I'm going to give the answer to the question I always ask people. And I must say, when it's in an online medium, I feel like I could just go on and on forever, because the weekends are something that I get much better at as I get older. Look, we had a Barbie sale on Friday night. My youngest daughter has finally grown out of her Barbies. Which I never relinquished ownership of, I have to say. So she put them all out in the footpath, post a letterbox to local kindergartens, made $64.50.
Wow.
Of course, Dad turned that into a maths lesson, which was boring for her, but useful for me. Then we went out and had hot pot with our Chinese teachers. And that was really lovely. Then Chinese school on Saturday, and then Saturday afternoon, watched the football. which something I've struggled to become emotionally involved in throughout my life, but as I age, I find is more and more interesting. And then finally on Sunday, I can't remember, so it must have been a lot of fun, but might have involved bouncing our rabbits. We have 2 pet rabbits, and you do not take a rabbit for a walk, you take it for a bounce. So something like that.
It sounds like a full-on weekend, Amish, and I
Yeah.
hope your daughter captured
Fresh
one
though,
of
and
those.
happy to talk about assessment, Elaine.
So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you. Do you want to share your screen so that we can
Yeah,
go? And
sure.
while you're doing that, just to tell everyone, as we are actually listening to Amish, you may have questions. Please pop them into the chat, so it'll make it more efficient when we are taking questions later on in this session. Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Amish. Over to you.
Thanks, Nalini. And I will talk for half an hour or so and be reasonably broad-ranging. So please put the question in and we can come back to it, or put the point in and we can come back to it. Or I can refer to my old friend Roger Headcraft, who happens to be on the line, and got a PhD in international politics and higher education assessment with me while we were both doing the OECD Hello project for about 4 or 5 years, touring around the world talking about engineering outcomes assessments. Only half of the slides are the same, Roger, so there has been a few light bulb moments since then, but unfortunately I have to say we still haven't cracked the assessment nut, but that's not through lack of trying. So welcome everyone, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to UNSW, one of my favourite institutions in the world, not least because it's primarily, in my mind at least, an engineering institution, and I love engineering institutions. They're very functional universities in which to associate, so really pleased to contribute. Thanks for the opportunity to talk, and for me it's much more interesting to talk about your questions afterwards, so I'll hasten. First of all, just some framing context. I have a very broad range of research interests and practical interests and teaching interests. And the reason for that is in Australia, we are an enormously significant sector in the country and globally. And yet we are actually really understudied. So people like me who specialise in higher education, and I'm just going to say at the outset, that's not the people working in the big 4 accounting firms that do a lot of the work in higher education for universities, but actual scholars and specialists and analysts in higher education have to cover a lot of bases. So I principally focus on high level matters, but delve into a lot of different areas, and assessment is something I've been working on for about 25 years, where I got my master's degree and worked forward from there. Productivity is, to me, one of the most important facets of higher education. It is a word that's been co-opted by economists. It's a word that I think, like I said in response to your very provocative question, Eleni, it's all about Barbie sales. I mean, I'm not saying we reduce our lives to a bunch of highly sharpened, efficient robots, but we can, as we expect our students to do, look to be improving what we do. As we work in our careers and our institutions. So for me, that's about being involved in design, policy design, educational design, institutional design, doing research on different facets of that design, making stuff. And, just because Roger's here, it was a conversation about tinkering, and engineers tinker, they make stuff and they build prototypes and stuff like that. That's really important, and eventually something changes. And I've just got some books here that come from publications that we've done looking at university systems across Asia. I'm really fascinated by Asia. It is the world's biggest higher education time zone now. How can we help education systems in Asia become the most productive they can? Most of them are new, last 30, 40 years. And now they have the enormous task of taking the world's biggest workforce by and large forward. So it's a really huge job, and assessment is absolutely front and center to that. So I retain my interest in assessment, not in terms of the psychometric models that we use these days, but more in terms of the policy implications. And nowhere is that more significant than in terms of lifelong learning. And for about the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with Skills Future Singapore and other countries across Asia. We had a skills summit here last week. So it's all about skills. Now, maybe in higher education, we like to think it's about learning and knowledge and stuff. It is as well, but ultimately, most people want a job, if not all people want a job at the end of a degree, and they need to be able to do some stuff. So how we understand skills and how we bring skill development to not just 18 to 22-year-olds, but increasingly across the lifespan is absolutely essential. And those of you who are a real professional, I'm not, I'm a faculty member, but if you're an accountant, engineer, etc., there is a process of keeping your skills up. But generally speaking, we confront that problem across the economy now. This in the middle is the model from Skills Future Singapore and the sort of skills they portend. They do skills planning for future skills and near skills and current skill gaps for Singapore, and then try and engage aspects of education supply in helping to upskill the population. And the problem they have is that a lot of that has come from adult learning and vocational education. But engaging the universities, and this is how I got involved, is been really challenging because universities don't become trophy institutions by doing lifelong learning. That I think will change. It will change for this reason, because we have been traditionally thinking about matching people with qualifications. And that's pretty much what higher education institutions around the world sell. They match me with a qualification, and then I get that and I'm done, and I can do another one, and otherwise I go and work. Actually, the future and the reality is much more complex than that. There are a vast array of things, particularly with people like us, and I must say I don't really know who's in the line, so I'm talking very broad terms, but we all need upskilling. You know, no one told me in 2015 that I might go and live in China. So no one said learn Chinese, but actually a reasonably educated robot might have said world's biggest higher education system, major research trading partner with Australia. Mightn't be a bad idea to pick up a few words, you know. So we've had some attempts at that, and it's not software that's going to do that, but it's really a frontier issue for all of us to think about how we can not just match people with qualifications, but match learning needs with the provision of learning resources. So we've really seen a big shift in the dynamic, the level and the dynamism of how we match people with learning opportunities. That's the point of that. And what that means is that we've gone from focusing, and all of us, even if we focus on PhDs, for various international reasons, most PhDs now are under the age of 30. Certainly wasn't the case 20 years ago when I was doing mine, but it is now. We've gone from focusing on, say, 18 to 22 or 22 to 25, or PhDs, to focusing instead on people throughout their lifespan. And of course, the year of 65 is completely arbitrary. Most of the 75, 80-year-olds I know are still at the most productive phase of their career. So that then leads us to ask several key questions. How do we identify those learning needs? And that little S with a hat, I'll come to later on. How do we repackage and deliver education? And I use the word repackage deliberately because it gets us far away from any scholarly notions that you must be a brilliant professor and you know, parade around talking about your wisdom in order to help upskill the population. Okay, there's a bit of that in the world, but actually that's not going to advance the economies in the way they need to be advanced. And how do we do that important matching process of people with those learning opportunities? So that's really the sweet spot, if you like, the broad picture of where I'm going to frame my remarks about assessment. All of a sudden, having written about that in this book, chapter 5, and if anyone wants a copy, I've got a bunch sitting at home because there were no conferences to give them away in the last couple of years, so please do email me. Came a wonderful experience in the last 2+ years, and it's become quite clear that we are now in a zone in which universities are in a different space. We don't deliver stuff into society. Society tells us what to do. Australian universities are struggling with that. We are struggling to find a social license to operate. We're struggling to find ways of restructuring the Australian Research Council to make that real, ways of measuring the impact and consequence of what we do, ways of listening to all of the communities and stakeholders in the first place and enable us to make good sense of that. And that's across every field in which universities operate. We are in a globally connected world, and we in Australia or across Asia are really lucky because it's actually the world's biggest higher education time zone. Where we are somewhat, I wouldn't say unlucky, but shocked, is the volatility of this and the sheer nature of the transformation that's underway. You can now do an entire degree, that's what that little image is, a snapshot from someone's WeChat account back in 2020, doing an entire Harvard degree sitting in Peking University in Beijing. I mean, an entire degree. That just wasn't possible. And I didn't really follow up, but I don't think she ever actually went to Harvard physically. That's what Chinese refer to as globalization at home. It has huge implications for how we do education, who does it, how we intersect with things. And if you sort of layer that thought on top of what I was just talking about before in terms of talent development needs and access to learning resources, you pretty quickly see that we're going to be in a really complex, globally connected space in terms of accessing learning resources. So that's the broad sort of context, if you like, in which I focus my remarks today about assessment. I have written most of these slides 10 years ago. I just keep bashing on. You know, I developed the quilt for Australia. It's my PhD. That was hugely controversial when I did that work back in 2002. And now, of course, it's part of the woodwork. So I'm hoping that one day I don't need to talk about the importance of assessment. I'm sure I don't to anyone here, but just to quickly go through and say, for me, assessment is not a really boring topic that makes people shake when they do exams. It is, in fact, a core part of how we do learning, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. We have some huge problems in how we do assessment because the way we do it, by and large, hasn't changed. And here are some of the problems which I commit almost all of in my own teaching, I have to say. Most people do, because we just haven't transformed the way we do it. We haven't had a step change in how we do assessment in higher education. Okay. Now, I mean, I'll just take one of these, arbitrary mapping to a curriculum. Even in a field like, for example, engineering and medicine, two fields in which I've worked with most of the schools in Australia and many beyond, even we have very close mapping between course, unit outcomes, assessment, task delivery, curriculum, and all that sort of alignment stuff going on. We're still not really at the point where you could do that matching job that I spoke about before. Okay, and I could go through each one of those points and talk to how they induce the need for us to improve assessment. That then causes all sorts of problems. People don't trust assessment, and there's ample evidence of that. Businesses don't trust the product. Is there any difference between, I think someone said this in the media recently, and I can't remember who it was. Is there any notable difference between a Monash and a UNSW graduate? Who was that? I can't remember. I read it in the paper. How do you discriminate those different graduates, and how do you do that in a way that's reliable and is tied with the institution's mission and contribution to the relevant professional community? Really complex, but that's where universities need to build trust. Otherwise, the business that hire the graduates don't have the trust. Ballooning costs. I have studied the cost, love studying the productivity thing. So the productivity of what I'll talk to later on in terms of stretched forms of assessment is terrible. It is basically the assessment we're doing in 1960 on heat. Okay, we need to think through, given the new global, open, connected higher education environment that I mentioned before, how we do assessment completely differently. And I'll talk about that. I could go on and on and on. We don't have the grade inflation conflate in Australia because we don't publicise students' grades in the way that they do. They're used secretly for student admissions, and students are given them, of course, but they're not part of the institution's quality rationale in the same way that they are in some other countries, principally the US. But it's an issue, and other emerging issues on the way. So where that has led us, and the big one I have to say is academic integrity issues, and a rate, according to the research compiled by TEXA in Australia, of about 7 to 10% of all assessment being purchased. And I would have to say from global organised criminals. That is a huge threat confronting assessment in Australia and around the world, but not something that we're going to solve today. it has led to the design of what I refer to as next generation assessment. A term I came up with when I did a small job with Online Education Services, who are jointly owned by SEEK, mostly now owned by SEEK, and Swinburne, and with increasing tentacles into other platforms in different parts of the world, and then developed further in the last 2 or 3 years with a software firm, Genix Ventures. I happen to be sitting in Genix Ventures boardroom now, talking to you, because we started to develop and continue to develop a platform that actually brings these ideas to life. Like I said, just having the idea and doing the research, good fun, but you know, if it ends at words, it's not going to change education. We actually need to start infiltrating normal education practice with tools that make it easy for the least interested faculty to do better quality assessment. And that's, I think, invariably where software is one of the only ways of doing that. So look, that's the project I mentioned that Roger was deeply involved in. Deeply involved in, so pay more thanks, Roger. From there, we sort of got the hint that we can use platforms. We did that with 250 universities in 20 countries in 3 different fields. We can online, we can, and that was 2010, 2011, something like that. We can actually progress that idea and all that technology in a way that makes it real for universities every day. We keep working. So here's where I'll just sort of move from talking about what I call traditional forms of assessment through stretched forms of assessment. You know, if you blow a balloon up so big, how far do you blow it up until it pops? I've never done it, but I've seen a child do it. That's sort of where we are some of the time in university assessment. People complaining about marking, quality, over-assessment. I could go on. Well, that's because we're basically doing the assessment that we had in the more traditional forms of higher education, which was still by and large around when I was an undergraduate in the early 90s, and moved them into, you know, not just the pandemically reshaped online connected form of higher education, but even, you know, that very international forms of T&E and cross-national forms of higher education. They weren't designed for that. They were designed for an elite higher education system where there was 200,000 or 300,000 people in Australia, and there's now that many international students, even now. So where do we then go and say, okay, we've done the curriculum piece, we can do more. Putting PowerPoints on Blackboard is not the end of that, but there's been a lot of good work in curriculum. We've done the teaching piece, but assessment is still, it's really difficult. So we still persist. That's what we call next generation assessment, where we start to look at co-created, shared, online forms of assessment. It's done by assessment specialists and somewhat customized to the learning problem. Here are the resources. I will go quickly through these. There's 5. Okay, the first is sound technical perspectives on assessment. So being a psychometrician and working with a lot of engineers, I tend to think of things in terms of what we call, you know, fundamental measurement model in terms of how we assess, come up with an estimate of student learning. The trouble is that way of thinking never actually makes its way outside the testing companies of the world, where I did work for 8 years at Australian Council for Educational Research. Them, ETS, all these sorts of firms, they use ways of studying student assessment that never make it into the everyday classroom. So it's a bit of a waste, you know, because actually the stuff that's used to model NAPLAN, for example, good, bad or ugly in terms of your politics and educational assessment, the actual psychometric models that are used to do that are far in advance of what are used in the everyday classrooms. But we need to make those models part of the everyday business of what teachers do. Fundamentally, we have a mark, and that's a product of the student. There's one of my doctoral students, Gaushi, her work, a teacher, an institution, a field, and then a whole lot of random stuff. I mean, that random stuff we know is there, but actually when you give a student a mark in higher education, it's like there's no random stuff. Now, the truth is, if they do, I don't know, 20 or 30 courses or units or subjects or whatever you call it over 3 years, you can get a reasonably stable estimate, I believe. but we just generally ignore it. Okay, so even when we admit someone into a graduate program based on an undergraduate GPA, we ignore that stuff, but we know it's there. Okay, and then of course we report it in some arbitrary way. And one of my first pathways into looking at academic standards in Australia, which led to some of the thinking about standards-based higher education into Texas formulation in the mid about 2006, was doing some work for the ATN universities, looking at all the different ways in which they reported student learning. So forget about all these measurement issues. Even within the ATN, they reported students learning in different ways. If we then apply business development or innovation logic, value chain logic, to saying, okay, how do we actually make a move in this area? Okay, that's probably a pretty good way of thinking about where are the sweet spots for actually making some advance. We can break assessment down into these steps, and all assessment has it, whether or not it's manifest or not. There's a planning stage, development stage, implementation stage, analysis stage, and a reporting stage. These little yellow boxes are where I've sort of sensed, to talk like a consultant for a little bit, we have the low-hanging fruit. Okay, so that's where we already see universities, talk in a general sort of sense around the world, have started to make some pathway. Okay, administering assessments, I mean, obviously through learning management systems, but increasingly, and I'll talk some more about this in the following slides, we see dedicated platforms being developed. In fact, that's exactly what I've been doing with my colleagues at Gen X Ventures for the last couple of years. Marking and verification. I'm not talking out of school because we published it in the report, but with Roger's help and a bunch of other very talented engineering educators, we train markers all around the world to mark those results from that OECD assessment. And there were about 80 or 90, you know, I said there was 250, but we did 3 fields. So it was about 80 or 90 or 100 in engineering. And the marking, and so we trained them. I mean, this is very specialized training that we did, not the sort, we don't do that in universities so much. This is really technical training. The variability was high, right? I mean, huge. So how do we go about reducing that variability? Okay, that's an area where we have loads and loads of work to be done. Number two is, so number one is like, how do we actually think about assessment? Well, for me, that's how we think about assessment in effective ways. It's the product of those pieces of information, and it's produced using those steps. Okay. B, what sort of research has happened? Well, we've got mountains of research that points a path for us to follow. We've got work on qualifications frameworks. Of course, that continues apace in Australia. I don't follow it in detail, the Australian debate, but it would appear to me, and this probably has been well considered, that you just cannot stack up micro whatevers they are unless you've actually assessed at that level and you have confidence in the generalizability of that assessment. May well be underway, don't know. We have work to align curriculum and learning outcome frameworks, work to do various forms of shared or collaborative assessment. I think that's absolutely essential. Don't understand why every business school has its own accounting exam. Work that puts that online, okay? And that's really important because we've got to be able to scale this. And then increasingly, assessments that are done in more structured ways. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, it's cookie cutter and it's dumbed down or anything. It just means that there's some practical, technical, and conceptual structures underneath the assessment. Okay, that's integral to next generation assessment, not just flying blind and asking basically every teacher in the world to do their own thing. And we wouldn't do that with music, but we do it with assessment. Then we need the right capability mix. And this is where it's been really obvious to me. And it became so clear I wrote a book about it because it didn't seem to be clear in the other conversations I was having, that universities don't work alone anymore. What the real eye-opener for me was a student I had at Schwarzman College about 5 years ago, and he looked at the procurement of online partnerships by major US universities, found a lot of contracts that they had signed with online companies, of which we have 2 large ones just down the road from where I am now. in Melbourne, and found that 20% of public education and higher education in the US was done by these firms. So whether that's good, bad, or ugly, I don't know. I mean, we're not talking about car parking. We're talking about curriculum, teaching, assessment. This is the core academic business of the academy. So whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but it's happening. And we could not find, for 2 global handbooks that I edited with colleagues around the world, we just couldn't find anyone to write about that in a public way. Of course, there's a lot of consultants doing work, but that's hidden. So that's not going to help anyone. So look, we need this mix of skills. We need the tech people. They make things happen. Yeah, and it can take time, but it works. We need commercial and institutional people, the COOs, the CIOs or CTOs, COOs. We need the chief academic people, the faculty. We can't ignore them, but they're not going to drive this. They just don't have the time, busy doing their work. And then usually we need some sort of regulatory impetus. The work on student engagement in Australia took off in 2006, 7, 8, because ALQA at the time asked the university. I was doing that with every university in Australia and New Zealand, but it would go to the university and there was nothing. This is pre-quilt, right? ALQA would ask the universities for their results. Okay, so the universities, of course, thought the sky was going to fall down and didn't want it. It's all on the internet now, so it seems bizarre to have these sorts of remarks, but they would not disclose their results. So ALQA kept asking for it, and over time, the appetite for using that information grew. And then, of course, you need some sort of assessment reform, and I'm aware that UNSW is in the process of doing this, so it involves all of this sorts of stuff. And the point of this slide is this is not going to be done by higher education researchers. It's not going to be done by software people. It's not going to be done by governments. It cannot be done unless it involves teachers. So it really does need a broad mix of capabilities. And it must have the right partnerships. Now, like I said, very hard to find any data on university partnerships. And there's a whole bunch of stuff on PPPs and the like, and there's stuff in the finance sector about, all sorts of leasing arrangements and this sort of thing. But when it comes to the academic core, it wasn't until about 2018, 2019 that the Chronicle on Higher Education took this on as a sort of issue. That's the US paper in higher ed, took this on as an issue that they were really interested in. But there's still very little out there about how universities actually procure and manage and do due diligence and exploit and don't get exploited by and develop partnerships with different firms. So again, I tried to set up some frameworks for helping principally the people involved in universities who do that work. And in some universities, they just don't have the people to do that work. I mean, the procurement people aren't the academic people, and they just don't have that sort of overlap yet. And of course, it depends who the university is. If you're a huge university, you build your own thing. If you're a much smaller university, you might just buy it off the shelf. I mean, in the start of the pandemic, the MOOC platform at Tsinghua University supported about 250 universities. So it just pumped out the curriculum, because they all had to go online. They didn't have the capability. Online learning wasn't part of normal, everyday higher education in China in the same way it certainly has been in Australia for many years. And of course, where do you distribute the different parts of that partnership? Is it in the ownership arrangements, the financing arrangements, teaching, support? So, and how do you get all these systems to work together? Reasonably new field. We're about 5 to 7 years into trying to understand this, and it's not all about tech, but tech is often the way in this finds its way into our lives. And then, of course, how do we engage institutions? What do we do? How do we review the systems, and how do we build up collaborations? And I'll just start to socialize this idea with you about institutions collaborating, because I think that's got to be the way forward. So here, then we get to the idea of smarter learning. Smarter learning powered, I guess that's the right word, by next generation assessment. Here's our website. Please do go and take a look. I must admit, this is something we did about 18 months ago in about 2 weeks. and we're still just trying to get the idea settled and the platform settled before we start to plug forward. There is a white paper on there which you can read. I'll quickly go through this and then finish and have some time for discussion. First of all, we've got an academic risk rating, and that's really a way of finding where in the assessment value chain an institution or a department has a problem. That's a work in progress, but that seems to me to be something that actually doesn't exist around the world. So you can go and use it. It's there. In fact, it's probably sitting around this office here somewhere on a server. I don't know. It's private. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to put a fake email in. That then helps to design next generation forms of assessment, which can then be deployed in various productivity solutions, hopefully underpin smarter learning, and at the extreme lead to all sorts of collaborative assessment. And the idea for that really came out of the work with the engineers and the medical deans in Australia over a period of time. I'll quickly go through this. Like I said, please do go online and you can push the buttons and stuff. It goes nowhere. It does generate a report which gives you a diagnostic benchmarked as to the strength of your institution's assessment in various ways, or your own assessment. I mean, it's could be at any level of diagnosis. And that's going to become more and more important in highly internationally exposed countries like Australia because of the problems of contract cheating. Okay, and you can create an academic integrity report. There it is. It's got a little microscope, and it comes up with an assessment of where your strengths and weaknesses lie with respect to assessment. Next generation assessment, I have talked through a bit already. That's the briefing that I produced with online education services about 5 or 6 years ago, probably more like 4 or 5. But the idea basically is here, we're not just doing quality improvement or efficiency improvement. We're actually shifting into this new space where assessment is actually not just cheaper and not just of a better quality, but actually helps students learn better. That's why we're doing this. And the flip side is if we don't do that, we're actually not helping students learn. And there's ample instances we could all talk about where that happens. So we want to try and move beyond that. The productivity solutions really go to the platform which we've been developing. And we just actually finished a chapter in a SAGE handbook on online education, and we wrote the bit on assessment platforms. There are about 5 or 6 or 7 that are mature in the world. One is based here, and it runs millions of assessments a year. And what we have been doing is rebuilding that for the sort of lifelong learning skills development, next generation applications. Yeah, so I mean, there's the core aspects of assessment, right? And the LMS just don't do this. The LMS cannot do this. LMS is a PowerPoint repository, and you can put up a PDF and do some announcements. I did my PhD on Blackboard 20 years ago, and it has changed, but it just doesn't do this stuff. This is what I'd actually call a learning management system. I'd call that maybe a courseware management system. So that's where we're trying to come up with a different type of platform. Once you get that, you can then start to use these different productivity tools in all sorts of ways, right? To optimize the implementation, have collaboratives of makers or markers, as you may want, to benchmark the reporting, and then get people working together. There are, like I said, a very small number of platforms that can do that. Having them in such a modular way that they can be plugged in and used by institutions in different ways is really, we're at the outset of that transformation. We're probably with those platforms where we were with LMS in the around the turn of the millennium. Okay. And of course, then once that's set up, that's my dream. Yeah, but I think we're still about 10 years away. Always 10 years away. We'll get there. But once we do that, you get this value creating constellation. And all of us will have seen this happen in some aspects of our work life, where education, the administrative side and the technology side, has actually led to a step change in how we think about what we're doing in education. I mean, the obvious example is what we're doing now, using Zoom as a means of collaboration. Okay, so look, I'll leave, you do go and look at the website, but we have studied this now in we've done pilots, most recently this year. I'll talk about that in this slide here. in many countries. We just finished one in Canada, China, Australia, India, United Kingdom, Canada, quite a few others. Did one in Morocco, Colombia, a few other countries. So look, part of this is not just to obviously think about how we can work within an institution, to how different cultures react and how the platform reacts across different cultures as well. So this is an area where we learn by bumping into things. And as we bump into those things, we can bring those learnings back into the development of the platform and repositioning it for people like you so that we can do our work better. I will stop there, Nalini, and leave it up to the discussion, which hopefully is robust, creative and productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amish, for that thought-provoking talk on assessment. It's been well received, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to open up now for questions. Does anyone have questions? You can either put your hand up to ask the question, or you can drop it into the chat line and we'll take those questions. We have one already from Gary Whelan. Gary, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to? If I don't see Gary pop up, then I will ask it on his behalf. So the question, Amish, is, could you please expand on how next generation assessment can facilitate a broader view of students' development of skills and interactional capabilities rather than focusing only on their knowledge base?
I think there's many aspects to that question, but I think the crux of it goes to how we can get away from students sitting in front of computers typing away using looking at, is that right, looking at different forms of interaction and behavior and stuff like that. I mean, this is already happening, of course. I mean, in medicine they have all sorts of robots and things that they use, and we have clinical observations, and this firm does assessments of people in India learning how to use advanced power engineering equipment, and that's through observation and peer review and all sorts of things. So actually the modality, if you like, whether it's a cognitive assessment or a spoken assessment or watching someone use a piece of kit, I don't see that as necessarily an obstacle these days. In fact, once we take something into a tablet, for example, and away from an exam environment, you can do many more things. And if you cross-validate that in ways that build up assured pieces of data, it's a lot more, we would say, authentic and real than just having a student sit down in an exam hall. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered that question, but that seems to me to be the crux of it.
I think you may have partly answered that, but we can come back after Roger's question. Roger?
Thanks, and Hamish, that was very interesting, and a wonderful opportunity to revisit old times, I suppose, the discussions we had around A Hello. I've got a couple of questions. One is kind of a follow-on, I think, to the previous question, which is really related to professional practice, which is much more complex than skills. And I think it's something we kind of grappled with a little bit in A Hello, trying to get scenarios that students could try and give some sense of, that they'd reach some level of maturity of professional insight, rather than I can apply this equation to this problem. The second question, if I can add it, is how do you actually get deans and heads of school to buy into this process? This is exactly where we're at with the engineering deans at the moment. So I'd be really interested in your reflections.
I just saw, Nalini, the written part of the first question. I think and goes to what Roger said, there's something about the interactional side. I assume the interest there is in the social aspects, like, how do you assess me now? Like, how could we do that? Well, of course, we all participate in interviews where people fill out little forms and trade data and stuff like that. In fact, when I was at ACR, we did an analysis of the MMIs that were very popular. I don't know if they still are, but very popular in medical selection testing at the time. There was a fascinating guy, and I'm sure you must have been in the room, Roger, some guy at Tokyo Tech. He said, why don't we do the students doing interactive gamified assessments as part of their as part of the engineering assessment. In fact, you can tell, I mean, obviously I'm dominating the conversation now, but that's the rules of today, but if I was doing that and Roger never got a word in edgeway, then I would be marked down. So we can get that. There's been work on that. It seems to me that the problem there is not actually getting the data, it's figuring out how to make sense of so much data. But what that tells us is, of course, you can capture the information about all sorts of quite complex interactional, professional skills. I know someone who's a specialist in hand gesture analysis. And every time I talk to her on Zoom, I make sure I don't do this too much because I know she's making something of it. So look, there's all sorts of stuff that can be done. I did meet with my colleague at Genix Ventures in December last year. Someone in Singapore, and I couldn't tell you the details, but I could look them up if anyone's interested, and they train nurses how to do triage work by interacting with robots. So, not great, but maybe you can actually refine your skills by doing that. I think the second part of your question, how do you get people to buy in, Roger? Well, we had hoped that the crisis of the pandemic would actually do a lot of that work for us. Unfortunately, around the world, what it did is it got people obsessed with plagiarism and remote proctoring. And if you actually look at the value chain that I put up and the assessment diagnostic that's there on the internet, which we're just writing up in a paper now, those problems, remote proctoring and plagiarism, about 1% of the whole thing, you can actually mitigate the need for those tools if you design your assessment right in the first place. I'll give you a very simple example. If I put in my student ID and it generates my engineering problem using the platform, if I copy from Nalini, the platform will know that I've copied from Nalini because it will be using her seed from her student ID. So whether or not, so you see what I mean? You can actually design assessment in a way that you don't need those downstream tools. Anyway, I don't think there's a single answer to that, Roger, except to find people who are interested and get moving. The key to success, I have certainly observed, is to not sit around and talk. It's just prototype stuff. In China, we got 5 business schools from submitting their items to assessing about 1,500 kids from 5 business schools all across China during the pandemic. We got that happening and reported in 2 months. So when you think Hello took 5 years, there's a huge productivity advance in the technology that's available. But there's also a way of thinking about it as a software problem, not a policy or a research problem. Doing rather than talking, I think part of the answer. Because you can actually get it wrong and fix it. I think I'm just describing what a prototype is, but that just seems to me to be how to get this stuff moving, not to sit around and wait to perfect it, because I've been waiting for software firms and people running higher education systems and institutions to perfect this stuff for 20 years. And it seems to me we could have been a lot further advanced if we'd just done stuff.
Yeah, completely agree.
Thank you for that, Amish. I think there's another question from Bianca Maleka, and I think a question is really about what is the pros and cons of programmatic assessment and many data points versus modular unit-based assessments? Is one more valuable than the other, or do you see us losing some important information if we disaggregate assessments from units and courses, as people call it?
I mean, that's a really, I assume by programmatic, and I don't know where she works, but that's at a high course level as opposed to a unit level learning. I mean, I think, it depends someone on the field as to how stackable this stuff is, right? And we can talk about stackable areas of knowledge and non-stackable areas of knowledge. I mean, my undergraduate major was in philosophy. You can study one area of philosophy without knowing anything about the other area. So it's not necessarily a cumulative field. But presumably, if you've got some design of what you want the person to have achieved, you can then take that back into an assessment design that either stacks up or down. Now, I'm talking general terms, I'm not answering the question because I don't know the context, but where we did the work in China over a couple of years was with statistics and business studies, first year business studies, because it's quite chunkish. And where we've been working more broadly internationally is in the language testing area, because again, that is quite cumulative and quite well defined. So it does depend somewhat on the field as to how much you can add things up, or you would even want to add them up.
Thank you for that. Stuart Clark has a question. I think the heart of this question is about assessment for learning, and how can we make assessment more inclusive if it is for learning?
The idea we have is to put assessment at the start, not the end of the learning process. It has long bemused me that when you lecture people in higher education, you often have no idea. Like, the registrar's office doesn't tell the lecturer who they're teaching, but that does happen in primary education and secondary. When I taught I used to teach in the science department at University of Melbourne and in the business department when I was doing my PhD, and statistics. And in the business department, they gave us photos of the students and told us a bit about them. And I must say that really helped, because you sort of knew who you were going in to have a conversation with about central limit theory or whatever it may be. We do need to know something about who we're teaching. And if we put assessment at the start, that's an important part of finding out what people already know, and we may well find out that we can shave a lot of time off what we're going to teach them. Now, in terms of institutions that sell 12-week semesters and add them up over 3 years to sell a qualification, and there's a sales process there, not just for international students, but for university students in Australia as well. Then money is transacted, and I'm deliberately putting it in that term. In terms of doing that, that's not going to work, because you may well, and I'll use a word that in Australia is used in a different context, but I meant it in a much broader sense. You may well find that if you look at my RPL, that I only need to do a semester. And we've all had experiences of probably being asked to study things that we didn't need to study. But don't forget, we also teach students things that they already know, and they must be terribly frustrated by that. So if we put assessment at the start, that's actually one way of doing that. I think the question also has a sort of inclusivity aspect to it, if I may. And the best work I can refer you to is by Bill Tierney, semi-retired now, but over in California, who looks at the use of games to engage poor Black and Hispanic students or children in LA in higher education. He realised they're really good at playing games, but they couldn't quite speak the language of university admission. So he used that to, in a way, assess their skills and bring them into the higher education area as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that explanation and responding to all of those questions, Hamish. We appreciate it very much. We've come to the end of the session, and I'm going to pass over to Louise to thank you and also to close our session. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks, Nalini. Hamish, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, comprehensive and insightful presentation. I think it stimulated us to think a little differently about assessment and approaches to it, and especially taking a perspective that individual academics often don't take. And I think it's great for us to try and place it in that bigger and broader context. So really, really helpful. And as our the discussion that's been generated, you'll see you have definitely stimulated a lot of interest for us on our behalf, which I really very much appreciate. And yes, indeed, I can see people joining me and saying thank you very much indeed for making that time for us, especially when you're visiting here. It is wonderful. And I know that many of us will be following up with you afterwards, both to take you up on your generous offer of a book,
Please
and
do.
also to go to the resources you've made available for us on your website so that we can follow up in that space. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Louise. Nice to meet everyone, and please do get in touch if you're interested in this area.
Thank you, Hamish. That
Look
is
forward to
a
it.
generous offer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, just to remind you, the next Scientia Education Academy lecture will be on the 18th of October. It will be in a hybrid format, and it will be given by Professor Karen Hauer from the University of California in San Francisco, a wonderful institution where I did my postdoc. So of course I know she will be outstanding, but yet again, an opportunity for us to hear more broadly across the educational sector, which I think is fantastic, and what's becoming a great keynote of these Scientia education lectures. So thank you to everyone. Thank you very much, Laura, for organising, Nalini, Patsy, and the other co-director, two co-directors and the other directors within the Academy for organising and setting these up for us. And I also wish you all, for those in the Sydney campus, for the start of term 3 next week, and hope those on our Canberra campus and in the medical faculty are coping with the ongoing teaching. Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon, and thank you.